So this is the 9th of February issue of the news update in transport in the time of COVID-19. And don't forget to contact me with your news. And if you want the slides sent to you immediately, I can send them to you on that or any specific queries. And the general principle or theme this week is targets. Targets. Right, just to remind you, last week, this was the Prime Minister's quote. There's always opposition to these schemes, but as the polls show, and as they found in London, the majority support them and we should crack on. So that crack on is the background to what's happening this week. And we had an announcement from the Minister. We want 50% of all journeys in towns and cities to be cycled or walked by 2030. That's interesting because it's a less than 10 years away target. Targets are often up to 20 or 30 years away. So in London, the Mayor's transport strategy with quite good targets is by 2040 and came out in 2016. Steve Norris's target was to double and double again the numbers of people cycling over about 15 years. And of course, these were targets which were the Steve Norris's target was not met at all. And that was from Grant Shapps. There's a little video which was put online by your party parliamentary cycling and walking group responding to Lillian Greenwood. And I've got a hat tip to Carlton Reid from something about that video, which I hope you can see here. I've circled it in red there. And what Carlton noticed with his eagle eye was that there is the book by Pete Buttigieg, who is, I don't know if I pronounced that right, that's the gentleman who is working for Joe Biden on transport. He's been talking about road user charging, he's been talking about changing the nature of streets, restoring them for pedestrians and cyclists. So in other words, certainly in American context, he's a good guy, and he appears to have been read by Grant Shapps, unless he's just sticking it up there for show. But it does raise some issues like, is this replacing or superseding previous targets? As Lillian Greenwood asked, he seemed to say, yeah, this is now your new target. And there's an issue about, which we've talked about whether we're going to get the full levels of active travel funding, and it should be about 400 million a year, but we don't know if it's going to be that. And even then it's only up to 2 billion by 2025. So there's that issue. We want to know where Active Travel England is to supervise this. And how does this claim fit in with his commitment to a roads building program, which is going to encourage more people to drive? So we're a bit skeptical about that. But this is your quote, which you can flag up to local authorities who want to know what your authority is for what you're going on about. And also another question, what is he going to do about local authorities that just don't want to play ball? And the hate mail said he will press ahead with widely hated cycle-friendly road schemes. Don't need to spend much time on that, but do need to spend a lot on this. I know I do say some things are must-reads. This really is a must-read. It's an article by Joe Dunkley in the At War with the Motorist blog. It's not a very long piece, but you should read it because he's saying, we've had all this before, it never got anywhere. And Chris Boardman said something like, it's a good thing to say, we need bold action in order to achieve it. And what Joe Dunkley does, one of the things he does is he says, look at this graphic. And here we've got walking, here we've got cycling. This is London. And here's 50%. 50% would be across here. Now, to get up to there, these are 2018, 2019 figures. They're not going to be much different now. To get up to that, you're going to have to do significant changes. And a lot of us would say you need a lot of stick as well as the usual carrot. You need to really push for things. So do read all that. And coincidentally, one of the things that I picked up was this article in a multidisciplinary journal of population health and policy. It's actually about the government's obesity policy, which, as you know, is related to active travel, but it's making some general points. And it says, when government publishes a strategy, do you expect the policies to be implemented? We found that the way policies are proposed means that the majority are unlikely to be. Our research published today analysed almost 700 policies over 30 years. And it says in the policy points, it finds that government obesity policies have largely been proposed in a way that does not readily lead to implementation. The governments rarely commission evaluations of previous strategies or learn from policy failures. The governments have tended to adopt less interventionist policy approaches, and that policies largely make high demands on individual agency. With individuals having to make behavior changes rather than shaping external influences, and are thus less likely to be effective or equitable. So that should all ring a bell with you. That is where we are, and that is about why things have not been effective so far. Okay, so that's the targets. Now, bit of good news here. This is an IPSO ruling in a case, which you may recall from last year. There were lots of photographs of cyclists allegedly disobeying the rules, all close together, when in fact it looked pretty clearly, although it was use of long lenses, foreshortening things and making people appear closer than they actually are. And one of the cyclists shown in one of the pictures didn't like this and made a complaint, and it was upheld, a complaint against the Daily Mirror. Now, Mark Treasure actually tweeted that some other people who had been misrepresented, the stories are still up on the Mirror website because they didn't complain. You have to complain about something which involves you, apparently. Anyway, bit of good news. Oh yeah, now in the Daily Telegraph, here's this excited headline. Thousands of drivers are prosecuted after angry motorists submit dashcam clips to police. It's about third-party reporting. A staggering 32,000 submitted in 2019, of which a quarter resulted in prosecution. And they give the figures for different police services. And this was actually all collected by the RAC, so good for them. Nice to see them doing something to support or at least publicize third-party reporting. And publicity is absolutely critical for this. But I did a bit of calculation, and I reckon that based on registered vehicles in that year, the average chance of a successful prosecution, which is normally 3 penalty points and a fine, was 1 in 5,000 vehicles. So it's not exactly like third-party reporting has actually really taken off, but enough to give the Telegraph this kind of excitable headline. Okay, your stupid low traffic neighborhood analogy for today comes from the Reverend Giles Fraser with this photograph saying, "These now everywhere in my parish. The place is beginning to feel like 1970s Berlin." So I tweeted saying, "This is stupid, beneath you. I thought you believed in local community." And in fact, his what do church people call parish? Yes, his parish is Elephant and Castle, and I believe the majority of his parishioners don't actually have cars. I said the key feature of a traditional local community was far fewer people driving. And anyway, what's your alternative? And I got 165 likes for my tweet, so that was nice. Right, here's absolutely crucial piece of research for you. This is from Imperial College, and it's about the numbers of people in London who die from poor air quality. It's specifically looking at nitrogen dioxide and very small particles, PM 2.5s. And it gives a figure which is about a third to a half as high as its original one done previously, but it's still pretty interesting figures, 3,600 to 4,100 for the last year, which we've got figures from. And that's the report. That is something you should constantly refer to. That is the figure which is now our go-to figure. And also today in The Guardian, you've got figures for noxious emission deaths, deaths from particles from fossil fuels, not just from transport, but other things like wood burning and so on, which gives a number which is twice as high as previously thought. So do go to that in The Guardian, and for Britain, that is the figure to go for, because it's for London and you can kind of downscale it very roughly for any big town or city. A nice little tweet from London Fire Brigade. Firefighters reminding residents to park safely and not too close to junctions. When crews arrived in this incident, they had difficulty parking due to the way a number of other cars had parked. So one to remind your whingers about low traffic neighborhoods supposedly slowing up the emergency services. Yeah, basic stuff to read. I've done that before, but please, the Action Vision Zero manifesto for Police and Crime Commissioner elections is going to be relevant until May. I mentioned this must-see about 20 minutes from Professor Allwood on what absolute zero and net zero mean. Mentioned that last week. New piece by Carlton Reid on the cycle industry, which is very revealing. And there's a news item on Halfords claiming they've had astonishing levels of uptake on their bikes. 18 sold every minute over Christmas. Let's hope the forks are on them the right way round. A new piece by Mark on low traffic neighborhoods and whether you need camera enforcement. Most of what he was saying is it shouldn't rely on cameras. And I started a bit of a correspondence about, could we have rising bollards or fire gates which have electric key fob activated locks, and we had a bit of a discussion about that. I think it should be a way in which we can say we can get exemptions for necessary emergency vehicles, but nobody else, and it should be able to be done with a moderately high-tech solution. Mark is big on relying on very fixed bollards and other pieces of engineering, as you might expect. Still flagging that up for Cycling UK, asking for clarity on English exercise rules. The latest research from Commonplace and Giulio Farini on how LTNs really mustn't have exemptions for short car journeys for local residents. That's from last week. Don't forget that health and wellbeing webinar done by people in Islington. And that's all from last week, nothing new there. Diversity page. British Cycling names members of its new Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. Looks pretty hard hitting, although don't forget British Cycling is primarily about cycling as sport. There's a Facebook page for London Women on Bikes. I believe we may have one person from them speaking soon. Don't forget these things: Cycling Diversity Alliance event on March the 2nd, and launch of Women in Cycling Industries in Europe, and Pave the Way, all recent items. The delay slide is now the what's happening slide. Nothing new about active travel. A bit of a whisper about an agency involved in supervising things. Can't say anything about that. And Part 6 Road Traffic Act 2004. Now, the pressure group Mums for Lungs, who are pushing for school streets outside London as well as in London, wrote a letter to the minister and got a reply on 29th of January saying, it is not possible to say when in 2021 the powers will be available. DfT is committed to bring these powers into force in a timely manner. In other words, stop pushing us. So it's due to happen, but it was announced as something which was going to be pushed for last May. So, and it's been argued for by Cycling UK for years, literally years. Okay, I mentioned this last week about Highways England, who seem to have not done 160 cycle schemes, which they were supposed to, with Rafe Smith suggesting money's gone into Brexit lorry parks instead. Brighton and Hove, I mentioned, are going to sign the Road Danger Reduction Charter, and they have a new consultation on what they're due to do. So if you're anywhere in or around Brighton, do take a look at that. There is this body, the Highways Research, the HRE group, Historical Railways Estate Group. And they are doing a lot of stuff on cycle paths and rail projects under threat from Highways England, taking out various bits and pieces which can be used for greenways, off-road paths, bridges to help cyclists cross things and so on. So they're an interesting group, Historical Railways Estate and Highways England. In Hereford, they've stopped work on the bypass due to a decision made by the council. Yippee! Not so yippee is this from Manchester City Council in Blossom Street, Ancoats. And whoever sent this in said this gap is 30 centimetres wide. I'm not sure if it's that whole bit there or just this bit. But I mean, that does look a bit wonky, frankly. So do try and get a nice engineer in, Manchester City Council. And they seem to have done well. This is part of the B network and everything. This looks very interesting. It's bi-directional, but it seems to have been warmly welcomed by people in Manchester. And Southampton, a bike lane is due to be removed. Bad news. I'm not sure if that's one that went in under active travel funding last year. I think it was just a advisory cycle lane. Right, London. Still a lot happening about the Bishopsgate decision and the pending appeal. That's kind of hanging over everything in London. Schemes that went in will stay in place, but we want to see a good judgment in the appeal. We want to see that overturned, and maybe a recommendation to do more thorough assessments and consultations. But street space has to go ahead. Gave those figures last week. And here's a Freedom of Information response about tranche 1 allocations. The boroughs that didn't get the 400k for the tranche 1 were these ones: Bexley, Bromley, etc., the usual suspects. Tranche 2 allocations are coming through, and I'm indebted to Luke, last not lost, a guy you should follow, who's given these links for where you can find out about allocations that have been made for LTNs or cycling schemes that should be going in ideally before March, certainly should be started before March. Cycling, that's active travel funding, of course, originally from Department of Transport. I've mentioned this guy before, John Stone. He does some nice videos along cycle routes with new infrastructure. And if you go to his Twitter account and go to that link, you'll see a nice video. Pimlico to Rotherhithe in 30 minutes along the top of the south of the Thames. And here's a graphic from August 2020. And I believe that was in from Martin Gorst, because that's what his Twitter name backwards spells. It's basically an argument for LTNs and why they're good with some figures. So, you might want to copy that off the slides. Okay, now this is an incident in Haringey. Mamar Moose, Deborah passed that on to me. Here's some very willful damage. Obviously, if you look at that, it's been done with an angle grinder, specifically targeting the signage. But what's really interesting is that this isn't one of the new sets of filters put in on LTNs under active travel funding last year and this year. It's actually a very old, long-standing blockage to motor vehicles, which was put in some time ago, and which the local residents have not complained about and have got quite used to. So the issue is, are these vandals just going around and smashing anything up, whether it's a new LTN supposedly not put in with consultation, or is it just a hatred of LTNs in general? And I would suspect it's the latter. And of course, concrete bollards are not so easy to vandalize. Kensington and Chelsea, a little video from Claire of LCC on what LCC are doing. Here's something from Camden, Prince of Wales Road. I've shown you this before. This is a bus bypass. There are wands on the other side and on this side further up. And the reason I've put in this picture is because they've added a blue stretch to alert motorists that they should be careful swinging left into that road. I don't know what you feel about this. Some people say, well, they want everything to be in the appropriate color. Other people saying color doesn't matter, whatever. You make up your own mind, but it does show that Camden is trying to do stuff. And here they are. There are a couple of sets of consultations on two quite important areas, and nice little graphics showing what's proposed. And it's actually, it should be quite easy for local residents to understand. In Brent, there's a discussion about the Harrow Road pop-up cycle lane, which went in last year by Brent's cycling campaign, talking about the good things, the not so good things, how they feel about what happens at bus stops, etc. It's interesting to read. In Richmond, here's this heading, cycling surges on Kew Road, where there have been wands put in last year. It's actually not a big surge. It's only up to 830 a week, but it is doubling the amount of cycling, and that's due to the pop-up lanes going in during the first, I think, about the end of the first lockdown. In Enfield, the Conservative opposition have called on Labour to withdraw 2 big LTNs, which have gone in and which I've discussed in the past. Haringey, now, there was something which I almost just put in as new consultation on low traffic neighbourhoods in Haringey, but according to Deborah, again, there's no actual plans about the specific design details. It's just the commonplace map. Haringey promised 20 school streets by March. 6 schools didn't want to know. Scheme is currently delayed by a month. So the LTNs in Haringey we're still having to wait for. Havering, some results of freedom of information work. That's the one I mentioned before. The quality of the first tranche bid was not good enough. Then they got 220,000 for 22 school streets, which went down to 3. And they're losing 4 school streets, which were, or losing the PSPOs, which were what was governing those school streets, or backing them up. Okay, now this is something about One Chiswick, which you may have heard about as opposing the bike lane in Chiswick, something which Jeremy Vine talks about a lot. And it turns out one of the people behind One Chiswick is a politician in the neighbouring borough of Ealing. And I don't want to get into party politics and saying it's specific individuals or whatever. But the fact is that what seems to have happened, if you follow Drew White's tweet, is that in Ealing, a lot of councillors are running scared of an actual or more likely imagined motorist backlash against LTNs, and that they're sort of, it's almost as if their default position is to not go ahead if they think they might lose some votes from some motorists. So that's this is a discussion of how it's happened in one place. My suspicion is it might have happened otherwise. And onechiswick.org is put up by the local pro-LTN cycle facility group to actually show how One Chiswick has been abusive and threatening to people. Okay, on to adverts. This is courtesy of Leo Murray. Just commenting on how we seem to get a lot of car adverts in our timelines. And this is the exciting new Tiguan from Volkswagen. Remember how they haven't exactly been honest about emissions, saying all of our vehicles are designed with the environment in mind. And Leo points out that the emissions of CO2 are recommended by the EU, or the target average for new cars is way below what the Volkswagen Tiguan emits, or rather Volkswagen claims it emits. Right, and finally, another advert from America. You may remember this quote, "What's good for General Motors is what's good for America." This was made by someone in the Eisenhower administration who previously worked for General Motors, and that's not exactly precisely what he said, but he said something along the lines that I can't see there's a conflict of interest because what's good for General Motors is what's good for America. Anyway, here's a nice little advert from General Motors for one of their vehicles, the Blackwing, the most powerful Cadillac ever. This top dog Cadillac Sports, I don't know why they say sport, sedan, hits like an artillery shell. Oh, thank you very much. So that's your General Motors news. And any questions?
Any questions or points of order for Bob? I think one came through, Bob, that it was emergency active travel fund, the Southampton scheme. That.
All right. Okay.
That one came through. Has anybody got any other?
That was banging, Bob.
Was it banging? Good. Terrific. Any other questions?
I can't see any hands up, so we might roll through because we've got a...
Yeah, I'll go on the chat thing to see if anybody has.
Bob is still available for you people. Make use of him. But now, Sally, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're all good.
Good.
It's yours.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Katja Leyendecker, who should be here somewhere. There you are.
I'm here.
And I just wanted, before she starts, I'm going to embarrass her. I met Katja almost 10 years ago, and I'd not long moved to Newcastle, and I'd started cycling a few years before in London as an adult, and found it completely terrifying and persisted. And I think maybe because I started cycling so late, I mean, I cycled as a child, I never lost that complete fear of cycling in traffic. And I met Katja and also Claire Prosper, who had started the Newcastle cycling campaign in 2010. And they were campaigning for more space for cycling. And I just thought, this is it. Why is nobody else doing this? And then of course I discovered lots of people were doing it. And I don't know why I'd never come across it before. But yeah, Katja and Claire have had, an enormous influence on me and completely changed the way that I kind of instinctively got that it didn't work and that streets weren't welcoming me, but I hadn't really kind of put two and two together and understood that it was possible to try and change this. And also this idea, I think, as well, because I was cycling with young children and I was getting all this messaging about how we should all be cycling to school because it was really healthy, and I just felt very angry because it was really obvious to me that the problem was not that people didn't want to cycle to school, although I'm sure lots of people don't. It was such a difficult thing to do, to cycle or to walk around really in the city with young children. And yeah, and so I suppose over the years I think Katja was somebody who always just had a very different way of looking at things. We always had amazing conversations about what the barriers were to change, and what we could do to try and change things. And so I've also then followed her throughout her PhD journey, researching women and cycling and activism, and again, had some very interesting conversations come out of that. So I thought it would be really great for her to come and talk. I think you're going to talk a bit about that. Is that all?
Well, we shall see. I mean, I usually put my slides together and then, I might talk about something else, not entirely else, but something, slightly different. Let's see what it turns out to be.
Right, takes us. But I just think, I just think that coming and finding a campaign which, was run by women and just started from the point that we wanted space, and it was about cycling for everybody, completely as inclusive as it could possibly be, and I've never moved away. I think for me, I was very lucky that to have met you both when I did back then. Right, over to you, Katja.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, lovely introduction. And first question is of a technical one. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, you will be able to.
Excellent. So I'm onto that. Let's see whether I manage. Now, let's see, just a sec. Right. I hope you can see slides now. Yeah?
Yeah, right.
Great. I see the thumbs up there. Big thumb from Brian. Thank you. Now then, I'm coming at this, of course, from the direction that Sally has already outlined. I'm from an engineering background by training. I'm a civil engineer, and then I started cycle campaigning, still working as a civil engineer. And I started to get really interested in, how this whole kind of cycling thing works in the UK. I'm originally from Germany, North Germany, where a lot of cycling happens in cities. And the older I got, the more difficult cycling got for me as well. And whilst Newcastle City Council at the time, kept saying we want people to cycle, there was very little done about it. So I did start on that subject, kind of cycling, and then I kind of felt like a woman in engineering. I felt like a woman in cycling. I felt like a woman in everything that I do, woman in cycle campaigning. So I started to put that kind of aspect, broadly, let's say, feminism into it, as well as infrastructure. So it's a mixed bag that came together, and I was kind of rattling about with the items in it, and it took a little while for me to figure out that engineering is not the right way of looking at it, but sociology and political sciences are, and that was the basis that I put my PhD on in the end. So it's a journey from engineering from the technical natural sciences, let's say, to the social sciences that I've kind of undergone over the last, say, 10 years. And it's they are different worlds, and I'm often treading in different worlds, and I seem to be a bit of a sort of a border walking kind of individual, which hopefully combined with a reasonable ability to talk, might actually give an interesting insight. So today I thought I was going to talk a little bit about cycling, sex and gender, the little difference, and to put things a little bit into context. And if any one of you has already, I don't know, knows the word heteronormativity, it's easy. Just sit there. It's a revision, and you might not get entirely new stuff out of this. But if this is a word where you kind of scratch, you squint, or you scratch your, behind your ears a little bit, sit tight, buckle up, and let's see where we can take this. Whenever it's about women, and cycling, it's usually this quote, particularly here by Susan B. Anthony, put in front of everyone. I think bicycling, she's American, so US American, I think bicycling has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. So the question really is, what does she mean by that? It's from 1896, so it's pretty old. And it's from a time when men and women were still essentialized, and a lot was put down to biological differences. Though it was often about practical changes, like on the left-hand side here, it was about dress, and that the way women dressed wasn't particularly helpful to the ability to actually cycle. The dress code was hindering women, so they invented their own types of dresses, as you can see portrayed here. As I just mentioned, essentialism, the discussion in let's say feminism can broadly be located in between essentialism and existentialism. So essentialism, as I just pointed out, has got to do with biology, has got to do with the real biological differences. It's when someone puts those views forward, they often come across as conservative, because it's all about let's not change, this is the difference, and it's always been like that. It's when people say this is the nature of things, as opposed to this is the nurture of things, as opposed to this is the culture of things, as opposed to this is learned behavior, where feminism, where feminine and masculine suddenly become words rather than the categories of woman and man, or female and male. And you can see that it's two different kind of categories, because you can put one together but not the other. So you can say you've got a feminine man, but you can't really say you've got a female man. So, you know, it's two different aspects we're talking about here. And the discussion has been raging, you know, over the years and decades. People of, you know, the conservative nature, you know, that says this is given by nature, are often evolutionary biologists and endocrinologists, you know, the people who look at hormones and how the body functions. And on the other side, the existentialism, which I call here the progressive part, usually say and express it as, you know, all this is socially constructed. It's not about sex, actually. It's about gender. It's not about sexual differences. And on this side of the debate, if we want to call it that, we have sociologists and often psychologists. I hope this makes a little bit of sense and, you know, kind of puts things into some context. I found that when I talk to people, sex and gender as two different words often get mixed up, used interchangeably. And if we bear in mind that gender is the cultural expression of the way we organize our society around men and women, then it, you know, the sexual difference, then it becomes a lot clearer. So when we start looking at these kind of things, sex and gender, and we start to look at the kind of this discussion that takes place, we often hear critiqued, actually, you know, the binary system. So should we essentialize? Yes, there are differences in body, but a penis doesn't keep you from washing up, for example, you know, to put it absolutely bluntly. You can do certain things regardless of your genitals. So, you know, the binary system is often put out there as a critique. You know, it's not black and white, and a lot of this gender stuff actually happens in a huge gray zone. It's not either or, it's a gray zone we have to kind of open up and, you know, hold the kind of the tensions that open up in that gray zone. Gender conformity is a word that comes up oftentimes. It means that you are, I give a practical example. I, as an engineer and a woman, have often felt that tension that on the one hand, I was supposed to be an engineer, you know, talk loudly, talk clearly, talk in an almost, let's say, aggressive kind of way about something. But I, as a woman, when I would do that, would be looked at, you know, sort of with slightly rolled eyes, or, you know, kind of out of the corner of my eyes, and think, what is that woman doing? Or maybe it's just because she's German. So, you know, there's all sorts of categories which suddenly start to collide. And gender conformity means, in the olden days, that you had to wear a certain kind of dress to be seen as a woman, as we have seen on the first slide, for example. Heteronormativity goes into sexual preferences, so that things in our world are pretty much organized around heterosexual norms, and that often goes into the critique of the family as a structure, often goes into discussing that the family as a structure starts to fall apart, and new kind of ways of living and lifestyles come out of that. Androcentricity means that the man is seen as the yardstick, and that the woman as a category is submissive to the man. I might come on to that a little bit later. And a really big word, and I hope that everyone has heard about it before, is epigenetics, namely that even the genes, you know, when people say it's in the genes, you know, it's given, even the genes are actually, through life experiences, could be trauma, for example, switch on and off. So that certain hormones get stopped, or certain hormones start to get produced, and that of course then also changes that individual. And epigenetics is also intergenerational, can be passed on from generation to generation. So this is where things really start to kind of come together. Sally's introduction mentioned it. I'm coming from the cycle campaigning scene that happened in the last 10 years, and I was grateful that we could start to really put the space element out there, and that we needed to talk about fair allocation and reallocation of space. And we have really changed. When I was in my PhD, I sort of supported that as well as saw it happening in hindsight when I was looking at data, that we went from a cyclist identity kind of activism to a cycle way, or spatial kind of activism. And that's a huge change that has taken place, not just in the UK. It also happened at the same time as these kind of change processes and transitions sometimes do around the world. It happened in the USA, it happened in Germany, as I could verify with my PhD. Yes, let's talk about sex differences when it comes to travel. So sex differences in this case, just to remind ourselves again, this is about the category woman as opposed to the category man, because this is how we collate data. And women's travel is more sustainable, or more sustainably done. Women drive less compared to men, and women use public transport and walking and cycling more than men do, whether we like it or not, but that's what the figures say. Still staying on the sex differences, we've got the orange continuous line for women, and the broken line is men. If we look at on the left-hand side here, all trips, we start to see that over the lifetime, there are differences in a number of trips. So women travel more up until in their 50s, and then are overtaken by men then traveling more. Just to kind of briefly explain that graph. When we take only one travel aspect out, which is commuting, then we really start to see that something happens to women, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We can only guess, but quite reliably guess that this has got to do with coming together and having a family, and so the trips to work drop down dramatically for women. If we look at shopping, sort of steady kind of difference. Women shop more up until in their 60s, then men take over. So just to say, there is the category man, category woman, and we can look at data sets like that and can start to talk about why that might be the case and how we can use that data to make policy out of it, or make a campaigning program out of it. All trips shown as one big circle, out of which 20% is the commute. This is true for the UK. This is true for Germany. This is the ratio between the commute and the care and maintenance journeys, as I call it here. And yet we spend an awful lot of time talking about the commute, because the commute clogs up the streets and clogs up the space, and it's a lot of engineering aspects are just circling, around the commute, and it's something we ought to talk about. So where women cycle is high cycling countries. I've put them into three different kind of categories here. So we've got Copenhagen and Amsterdam on the right-hand side up there. high cycle mode share, nearing onto 40%, as well as more women than men cycling. So if we start to organize our cities that these care and maintenance trips can be cycled, women will cycle them, and in our still sex differentiated world and way of living, that then shows up in data like that. Category 2, let's say the one in the middle, is kind of the one that I've been socialized into. Reasonable cycle mode share, almost a 50-50 kind of cycling ratio between men and women. And then we look at the UK, well, the Anglophone countries, let's say, and there's fewer women cycling there, but there's only a tiny minority cycling anyways. And we must bear that in mind, that is the case. So there's these categories. And then, yeah, sex differences. Another example, looking at the transport sector. So 78% and 80% of the transport sector are men rather than women. And again, it's probably a reliable guess that by bringing your lived reality as a man in our society into the transport sector, that and this is a space allocating and space producing kind of sector as well, then our cities will look a certain kind of way. And that's my last slide. I've just jotted down 3 quick thoughts that are important for me to get across as a sort of summary, but as you can see, it's or will see, it's also going off on a little bit of a tangent. So yeah, getting people cycling is something, are 3 words that really annoyed me these 10 years ago. Because getting people cycling, if you don't put it into further context, does it in a very kind of conservative way, which is, you are wrong, you need to be fixed, you need to start cycling in order to fix yourself and be good and be a good citizen. And cycling organizations sometimes do that, but I saw it from my local authority doing that. And if the context is, well, this is a spatio-political exercise, fine, I'm okay with that. Then let's say getting people cycling, if we get the environment set up so that it's not a strenuous exercise, that it's something that's easy to do, because why should transport be strife and a burden? And for many people it is, if we listen to them. Yeah, and having talked about all those categories for a lot of on different slides, and mentioned it in various ways, we do need to play with our data, and in particular looking at it, how we can use the data to come up with effective spatial policy and differentiate. There are different categories that serve different purposes. So the sex category, splitting it up into man and women, is not it's a valid category, of course it is. It's usually how data get collated, when you're asked, so what's your sex, and it's the easy one to split data into. But of course data sets can also be done by gendered activity. So for example, if we wanted to look at safe travel to school, then our question should be, so how do we collate data around that? And of course, with the question always in the background, what for whom? Because certain people are disadvantaged, certain activities are disadvantaged, and sometimes doing it by activity, by journey type, it might be easier than doing it by man, woman, sex differentiation. Yeah, so which brings me to the last point, really, which is, if we do focus on these 80% of journeys, which are the care and maintenance journeys, and you will only be able to do that if you have a little bit of a capitalist, critique So, you know, it's a difficult one because there is money in the commute. Of course there is. So, you know, other kind of values need to be put forward, you know, which will have to do with, you know, a good, safe neighborhood. You know, it is about citizenship and participation in you know, in urban life. And, you know, bearing in mind, I'm talking about cities and urban life here, rural. Relating cycling to rural areas would need something different, in my opinion. And yeah, you know, to bring it together as a kind of, you know, come together in a kind of community life, which in itself, again, you know, is almost opposed to the capitalism and the capitalist system with its markets, its market generation, its dataization inherent in it. That's the challenge, and that's the last words from me. I'm happy to hear any questions and suggestions, and you know, tell me what I need to do next, and I'll do it.
Excellent, thanks, Katja. Just pressed something really weird on my screen, but has anybody got any questions for Katja or comments in the area?
I've got a question.
Please jump in while I figure out what I'm doing.
Yeah, I'm always very conscious that we're probably just not collecting data about a lot of people cycling. We're always told that 3% of trips are cycle trips, but I look around the people who cycle, you know, on my journey, and I wonder how many of them, if they are at school, university, unemployed, retired, looking after really young children, not working, are they being counted? And how are they being counted?
You're asking me that?
Yeah. Do you and I suppose it's the bigger question of, I mean, I think part of the problem is that we are only really counting commuting trips, aren't we? Largely.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, because the commute is such a you know, has such a big market value. You know, it gets people to work in our, I can only say it again, capitalist system. That's the data that gets collated, and it holds this kind of symbolic value, of course, as well. Yes, you know, collating more data on different styles of trips would help, but it's probably, you know, not necessarily the government doing that, because it goes into you know, good communal life, and you know, whilst that is a nice aim, it's usually not necessarily what the government as such does, or if it does, it says something about it and wants to do it, but you know, how it then filters down onto the ground, local authorities, is yet another question. So yeah, you would have to have, feeling to me is, you would have to have a local authority really interested in, you know, pushing in their policy sort of communal life, citizenship, you know, public participation in space, and you know, also of course then relating it back to walking and cycling, and you know, what values could be created from that. Of course there are. It's just a question of changing. I'm thinking Newcastle here in particular, because that would be my background, which could be done. London boroughs might have already done something similar, and we could learn from there. Is yeah, another kind of feeling that I have about this subject.
Yeah, I'll just come in now. I was pressing stupid buttons before, but yeah, by all means, put your hands up if you've got questions, or just jump in. That's all fine now. But I've got to get into this like a commuting question, because I was having this argument only this week with someone who's like, you know, we've got to switch mode shift from the commuting trips, and I was like, talking about the Manchester network, I said, no, it's a success if we generate extra trips. So even if someone's getting to work in a car, I know, well, bear with me, because this, I knew this would get you going.
I'm bearing, Brian.
Well, because I was pointing at the health agenda, and the health agenda is all about generating active trips. So if someone drove to work and back, but then he went out for a ride, then at least they're getting some exercise. So it's it's too simplistic a trip model, I think, and some things can be working against you. And what I really wanted to ask you was your thoughts on how the focus on like the extra like maintenance and care trips will eat into that 50% target by the government at the moment to get more people active. So is that where the future lies in shifting ourselves up that graph there? Is that a real big focus there? Because that's kind of what we tried to do with the Quiet Ways, and I kind of feel that's lost somewhat in London now. I'm trying to bring it back with the B network in Manchester. That's my really long question, but great to see you again anyway. It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, that's the capitalist system in some ways. This is why I was just, kind of thinking, we have generated more journeys, and you think, yeah, I mean, but, are they good journeys? Are they necessary journeys? Or are we just, yet again about, yeah, big numbers, the bigger the numbers, the better we are kind of territory. Yes, of course, absolutely. It is about accessing in a different way and or looking at it at a different way into those kind of care and maintenance journeys. I think this is exactly what the graph is telling us when we see that more women, and bearing in mind it's on the whole, it's women still doing the care work, for families, as you have seen on the other slide. The women commute drops when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s. So it's exactly that care maintenance trip aspect that gets shifted for Amsterdam and Copenhagen on that graph, that then pushes the women-men ratio up. Absolutely. And bearing in mind, this is 80% of all the trips anyways, and we focus on the 20% trips because, that's just when everyone, travels at the same time. Though, I mean, are we learning anything out of COVID? I start wondering, about social change, how people are probably under certain circumstances willing to change, maybe. What is this kind of commute thing when a lot of people now work from home? So I'm really not sort of keyed into that discussion at all, but I suspect there might be a few things, to get out of the largely enforced changes that we've got at the moment, then, forcing changes upon our behavior and creating new routines, possibly to a certain degree. Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're all told about that in transport planning and modelling terms, because it's always been a preoccupation with peak. Just everything's designed for the peak, which makes everything look completely mental during the day, particularly when we're talking about signal junction designs and the like. So if we don't have as peaky a peak, what do we do with the space? It's kind of like one of those like great modelling questions we're asking. But yeah, I'll stop going on a bit. And has anybody else got any comments today? I'm hoping a few more people chip in. There's been some pretty awesome chat comments. It's always the same. You do it on the show and then everybody says all the best stuff in the chats. But by all means, speak up. It's a really interesting topic, this one, I think.
At least it was a presentation that said cycling, sex and gender, and I've used the word penis in there. So, I mean, maybe people just woke up exactly at that particular point thinking, oops, what's going on here?
Yes, you better watch out, yes. Oh yeah, okay, Roxanne. Yeah, I can see your hand. Come on in.
Thank you. I had a moment, I couldn't find the hand up button. Hi, Katja, it's so good to see you.
Oh.
Can we have you back, please?
Here I am.
So I'm seeing some interesting discussion in the chat, and I think I'm still evolving my thoughts here, so apologies for any rambling. But I think Tom's making some really good points about why do we have to differentiate between women's journeys and men's journeys when we should be building that inclusive cycling infrastructure that works for all. And I guess the way I'm interpreting this is not so much about saying we need special infrastructure for women, but more we need to know where to put it based on the kinds of journeys that are happening. And whether we like it or not, these journeys are still gendered. That's another discussion, but what we have to do is understand those journeys and put the infrastructure in the right place. And I'd say your area is about women, but we should be doing the same piece of work for children and older people and all the other categories, but you can't be the expert necessarily in all of them. Am I going down the right path here? Yeah.
Yeah, no, you definitely are, Roxanne. And, one thing that I haven't put in the presentation that I sometimes talk about is intersectional feminism. It has the word feminism in it, it switches people off, and then intersectional feminism is yet one step away from, or, further into this kind of weird territory and jungle. So it came, and I could give a full talk on feminism and how it evolved over the decades, if not even centuries. But the intersectional feminism is something that started in the 90s, and it was particularly Black feminists who said, I'm often not represented here, because being a Black woman is something different in the injustices that happen as opposed to being a white woman. And really interesting a debate that happened in feminism then, resolving in this kind of intersectional feminism, saying it's not just women, of course, that there are other social groups that are disadvantaged and that need to be looked at. And I don't need to recount them all, but of course it's age groups, of course it's different races, as I mentioned, and it might be ability, physical ability, mental ability. So, it can be all sorts of things. The problem that we have in general is that, that decision-making usually does need some form of categories. And if we don't categorize, that might be men, women, that might be younger people, older people. It's really, really difficult to sift through the data and kind of see where these differences are happening. The problem with the categorization is not that we do categorize. The problem is often in the interpretation of it, and that we don't look at enough categories to figure out what, for example, the real questions are for transport. I mean, I think the real questions for transport are these care and maintenance journeys. I think we really need to start looking at them, meaning focusing away from the commute / capitalism, and that makes it into really difficult discussions to be had. So don't fear, if there's any transport engineers there, don't fear to categorize, but ask yourself whether it is whether you've looked at sufficient categories, and to figure out what you're trying to do for transport, or specifically for cycling infrastructure. And I'm saying that as an engineer myself, who wants to create a story, who wants to create a narrative, and yes, we do need to categorize, but carefully.
Yeah, could I guess I follow that up with, we can also, by doing that, understand how those journeys are changing. And I would expect after the pandemic, we'll see more men not doing the typical commute to the office and taking on more of the care journeys. We're seeing that trend anyway, particularly in a place like Cambridge. So it's not about saying this is what women do, but actually we need to be allowing for more people to make care journeys. And if we made it more available to make those care journeys easier and safer, actually we'd probably see that also encourages more men to be able to take on those responsibilities in their life. Well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it opens up the bigger questions of how society is changing when it comes to family formation, when it comes to different kind of approaches to life. People are doing different things these days, and the kind of the core family exists, but if you look at, you just mentioned trends, if you look at trends, we're trending away from the general kind of core family that we used to have, and trending more towards kind of serial families, for example, or it starts to get really quite complicated in some ways, which but all these kind of questions are these kind of nurture and culture questions of what kind of society do we want to live in. And I sometimes say feminism has got this kind of question of what kind of society do we want to live in, and then for cycling and transport, like what kind of cities do we want to live in. So it always comes back to these kind of really big kind of questions of of our values, of our ideas about the current way of doing things, ideas about the future, the kind of life that we want to have, and kind of project and dream a little bit as well. And we mustn't forget that, as whether we are engineers or activists, or just someone interested in being part of public life. Got to ask those kind of bigger questions, and get ourselves together on finding some sort of kind of mutual answer, so that we can press for the same thing. Yeah.
Brilliant. Simon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, on a personal note, my kind of light bulb moments and all this. There's been lots in the chat about quiet ways and low traffic neighbours and what have you, and my personal kind of experience on this was just the moment when the quiet way that runs through Waltham Forest, through Walthamstow, that everyone used to commute on. It's the route that all the commuters used to ride on, went through a low traffic neighbourhood, what became a low traffic neighbourhood. And suddenly you'd see all these journeys that were completely nonsensical, didn't make any sense to, if you're a commuter, if you're riding towards central London, people are writing at right angles to you and doing all sorts of strange things. And then suddenly you have this moment where you think, those aren't journeys about work, they're journeys about shopping. They're journeys about swimming pools. They're journeys about all sorts of other amenities and trips that made no sense in the area before and then made sense afterwards. And so, I just wanted to kind of, because there'd been lots in the chat, I just wanted to say, yeah, absolutely. That's the moment when low traffic neighbourhoods and main road tracks kind of suddenly start to dovetail in a cycling sense and enable a whole load of journeys that really aren't about commuting anymore and aren't about distance. They're about kind of locality.
Yeah, it becomes about journeys of life, almost, you can say. When previously it's been, and sorry to sort of major on that a little bit, but previously when it's all been about capitalizing on getting people to work, and then suddenly, as you described, Simon, it's about life. That life just unfolds, and that that becomes meaningful, and that people then start to interact. I mean, I don't need to say what kind of snowball then starts rolling. It's really powerful, and it's always still in our heads, as opposed to getting people to work and back and quickly. So yeah, I mean, as you can start seeing, for me, it's a lot of times it's about actually a critique of our very one-directional kind of capitalist system, how it's majorly influenced and infiltrated, transport, and how we do transport, how we take transport decisions, as policymakers, as engineers, and so on. Yeah.
Excellent. Sarah, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katja. This has been fascinating. I think one of the light bulb moments for me, to just steal some of Simon's vernacular there, has been around thinking about the purpose of the journey rather than the journey itself, because I think the sort of thing that came to my mind then is, when I think about some of the women that I've spoken to over the past 6 months, it won't make a difference how safe you make their journey if they don't have somewhere to park a non-standard cycle at the beginning and the end of it. And I think that, like, when you start thinking about these purposes of journeys, you start realizing how many different tangential things are connected to these parts. That, I was having a conversation with a woman the other day who was talking about how she once tried cycling in London and it was too terrifying and she could never do it again. But beyond that, even if she wanted to, what she would use it for is childcare and shopping, and even the ability for her to store a bike that would enable her to do, both of those things in a way that she meant safely in her own home, in her own residence, wasn't allowed. So I think that these sorts of things, when we're thinking about safety, like speaking as someone who 9 months ago was like, London is not safe for me to cycle and I will never cycle on it, and now cycles all the time, safety isn't as big of a deal once you start than it is before you start. But I think that there are those other big barriers that exist as well, that when we think about commuter journey, or when we think about, when you forget that gender lens, or even forget about the purpose of the journey lens, you can somehow forget that those things are going to be necessary as well.
Yeah, and it is about different kind of, you know, accommodating different kinds of cycles as well. Of course, you know, I used to say, well, you know, I just cycle somewhere, and I just have a normal bicycle. So, you know, I just said I just cycle somewhere and I'll just lock it on some sort of lamppost or something. And it took me quite a while, because, you know, when I left Germany, this whole kind of alternative, you know, transport cargo bike kind of thing wasn't, yeah, it was there, but, you know, it probably didn't really have a tangent on me anyway. So, you know, and it took me quite a while, you know, we were talking, you know, 2012 or something, and I'm sure, you know, Sally had something to do with that as well. And you're starting to talk about the journeys that she makes, how she makes those journeys, what kind of cycles, and of a different nature she uses. And then suddenly, yeah, I can't just put this thing somewhere on a lamppost. It needs space, and it needs proper parking space. And it, of course, you know, needs space, you know, that needs to be designed in on those cycleways as well. So, yeah, and these are the discussions about these kind of care and maintenance journeys, because you have children with you, and so you really have to take special care of the way you are traveling about, or you have you've been shopping and you want to transport that home, so, you know, suddenly you know, have to put that somewhere. And yeah, it just opens up all sorts of questions, which, you know, I always think, you know, engineers and policymakers should take on as a challenge. But you know, with the standing of cycling in the UK society, I think we've still got a few kind of hurdles and barriers to you know, jump through, I suppose.
And on that point, I think we'll like draw this section to a close. But it's been brilliant having you on, Katja. I think you made us all think about the subject in a lot more depth than we had previously. But I'm going to allow Ruth to do an extra long final thoughts section now. So maybe she'll bring it in, and maybe it'll bit of the discussion. But Ruth, it's over to you for last words.
Oh God, scary. And I've got to try and share my screen. So I did have a lesson yesterday. Thank you, Steve. So let's hope I've done it properly. Okay, this takes me ages. Okay, can you see my screen? Yep,
you're good. We can see a side road.
Thank you. And those horrible red eyes. So tiny little bit of background to anyone who doesn't know me. Live in Chiswick, West London. I've lived here for over 40 years. My route to cycling came as most children in the 50s. We all learned to cycle and we did our cycling proficiency. But I then fell off my bike more than I stayed on it, so I wasn't allowed to cycle, and picked it up when I went to, many years later, went to live in Israel on a kibbutz, where I did cycle a lot, and then moved to Amsterdam, where it was a no-brainer to buy one of those big Dutch Dharma Fietsers, cycled everywhere, brought it back to this country. And it is very interesting, Katja, but I just wanted to share, in the 70s, when I cycled to work from Chiswick to Television Centre, North Acton rehearsal rooms, I was one of thousands, and I would say there were as many women as men. And we all cycled in skirts, and not the men, not then, high heels, flip-flops, no helmets. But the bikes were very heavy-duty bikes, which was very similar to the Dutch bikes in a way, 3 gears and low maintenance. I can tell you, I probably never, ever thought about having to repair a puncture. Then the 80s came, and I think one of the things that happened with women, because it certainly happened with me, was that it became okay for women and possible to own cars. Now, this could be very London-centric, but I think that there is something in that, because I was aware of it up and down the country. And it was the time of the Yorkshire Ripper, that featured in a lot of women's minds. We had a thing called Reclaim the Night. I don't know if you know about that, when we all started thinking, well, we must get out walking and cycling rather than being hidden in cars, but a lot of people found it was safer to be in cars. I couldn't understand why. I then tried to buy another bike that was a bit nicer. And by the late 80s, the only bike that I could find was a road bike or a mountain bike. And I did not want a mountain bike because they were uncomfortable and what have you. And a friend who's a traffic engineer used to work for Peugeot, and he said, yes, Peugeot made a decision to stop having step-through frames and to have motorbikes and road bikes, and road bikes and mountain bikes, So it took me a long time to find a decent hybrid that I could use. And I still can't get a skirt guard on a standard English bike. So that's affected my wearing a skirt. Anyway, that's a lot of background, but I'm now 67 and I cycle everywhere. And in fact, I was a single mother, cycled with my son on the back of my bike. I was the only woman around who did it. And I used to cry when I got home because it was so dangerous and it felt so horrible. But I was dogged and I was determined to do it. And in fact, once when my son got to the age of 14, he said, why couldn't I be a normal mother and drive him to school? So background to that. So this is on a shared use cycle path on the A316 between Chiswick, Richmond and Twickenham. It's a mere 3 miles, but most women would not do it. A lot of men wouldn't do it. A lot of children certainly won't be doing it. And this is a side entrance to a drive, and yet it's got double reds. And if you're in a wheelchair, the lip there is not suitable. How do I move my screen to the next picture? Anyone help?
Press the arrow across, Ruth.
Where's the arrow? Can't find the
just
arrow.
on your keyboard for your next imaging photos.
There we go. This is also, there's a lovely debate raging on Twitter at the moment about whether we should be tarmacadizing our road. This is NCN4 at Maidenhead. This is another reason why people may not be using bikes, because you get onto this kind of infrastructure and it's just impossible to use. We use it because we are. And we talk about cycle parking. A lot of people have to keep their bikes in their homes. But if you've got to ride on something like that and then take it indoors, it just doesn't work. Compare and contrast. No prizes for guessing where this might be. This is in the dunes in North Holland, and everywhere it's like this. It's shared use, but they share quite amicably. People walk, they have dogs, they cycle. It's fantastic. Flip back to this. I can't quite remember where this is because this friend took me on a weird and wonderful bike ride, but you can't get a wheelchair over there. You can't get someone with walking sticks, and you certainly wouldn't get a cargo bike or any kind of non-standard bike. This is what I tried to show last week. I often get accused of only really caring about cycling and not being concerned about walking. But I think if you make it appropriate to cycle, as with the surfaces I've shown before, then you can walk. Now, this is Hampton Court. So I'll just let you look at the video. So there's not one crossing anywhere on this very, very main section, which is a tourist section. The bike racks are all in the middle of a traffic island. And there's nowhere to cross. And they won't do anything about that. Oh, sorry. Right, have I got another photo? Yes, I've got some more. How do I get to my next photo? Help me. How do I get to my next photo, someone?
Yeah, if you just press on your arrow keys, Ruth, if you press the next to long arrow, it should take you to the next one.
Ah, that's why, because I went the other way. So we've been talking about women and cycling. This is a very, very typical scene in Holland, west of Rotterdam, where my partner lives. No one talks about women cycling there. The biggest number of people who do cycle are women over 65. Look at her bike, look at her, look at the woman behind her, look at him. He's on a step through and a low step through. In Chiswick recently, I saw a man about his age buying a bike with a crossbar, and the bike shop said, so you sure you wouldn't like a step through? No, they're for women, they're for women. I'm going to use this. He then went back because he couldn't get his leg over and he had to change it. This is a sign that I would like the Department for Transport to have, please. This means you're sharing the road with bikes, and bikes have priority. They have a similar one with a pedestrian, with someone on a bike behind. And, you know, if Grant Shapps is serious about getting more people cycling, walking, then he has to change an awful lot of the Department for Transport rules on signage, I think. So, and I think that's probably all the photos I've got. So I'll stop sharing there and come back. Sorry, that was all a bit of an off-the-cuff blah, but I think, you know, I keep saying we're not cyclists, we cycle. I think it's really important that we have to make it safe for everybody. And if your 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old can cycle, then so will your mother and your sister and everybody else. And there's just too much traffic. We won't get anywhere for as long as we have so many cars and so many people driving. And that's all I have to say.